Hey there, night owls. Tonight we're slipping beneath the silk screens and paper walls of feudal Japan, where passion burned as hot as forge fires and desire flowed like sake through the veins of samurai and courtesans alike. This isn't the sanitized version of Japanese history they taught you in school. This is the raw, unfiltered truth about how people loved, lusted, and lived in a world where honor and pleasure danced together in the shadows of ancient temples and pleasure districts. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world for these intimate journeys through history. Now dim the lights, maybe pour yourself some tea, and let's ease into tonight's exploration of desire, power, and the art of seduction in medieval Japan. Trust me, you're going to want to be relaxed for this one. Picture this. You're walking through the narrow streets of Kyoto in the year 1185. The Heian period is coming to an end, and the world is shifting beneath everyone's feet like a lover's whisper in the dark. The air is thick with incense from nearby temples, but there's something else mingling with those sacred scents, something earthier, something that speaks to the primal desires that no amount of Buddhist meditation can completely suppress. In feudal Japan, sexuality wasn't hidden away like some shameful secret. It was woven into the very fabric of society, as natural and necessary as breathing. The Japanese understood something that many cultures struggled to accept, that physical pleasure and spiritual enlightenment weren't opposing forces. They could dance together, intertwine, create something beautiful and transcendent. The samurai class, those legendary warriors we so often picture as stoic and emotionless, had their own complex relationship with desire. These weren't celibate monks living lives of denial. They were flesh and blood human beings with all the appetites and hungers that came with mortality. And Japanese society had developed sophisticated ways to honor those appetites. Let's start with the women who held perhaps the most fascinating position in this intricate social dance. The courtesans of feudal Japan weren't merely prostitutes in the Western sense. They were artists, poets, musicians, and philosophers who happened to offer their bodies along with their minds. These women, known as yujo, occupied a unique space in society where they could wield influence and power in ways that were impossible for most women of their time. The most elite of these courtesans were called oiran, and they were treated almost like living goddesses. Their elaborate kimonos cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. Their hair was styled into intricate sculptures that took hours to create. When they walked through the streets of the pleasure quarters, crowds would gather just to catch a glimpse of these moving works of art. But here's what makes it truly fascinating. These weren't downtrodden women forced into degrading circumstances. Many of the most famous courtesans became celebrities, their poetry published, their opinions sought by powerful men, their beauty immortalized in woodblock prints that we still admire today. They were entrepreneurs who understood that sexuality, when combined with intelligence and artistry, could become a form of power. The pleasure quarters themselves were like cities within cities. The most famous was Yoshiwara in Edo, modern-day Tokyo. When you passed through its gates, you entered a world where normal social rules were suspended. Here, a merchant could spend an evening with a woman who would normally be far above his social station. Here, samurai could shed their rigid personas and explore the softer sides of their nature. The architecture itself was designed to heighten anticipation. You couldn't simply walk up to a tea house and demand immediate gratification. There were rituals to follow, ceremonies to observe. The approach was as important as the destination. Clients would first visit tea houses where they could observe the courtesans from a distance, perhaps exchange poetry, engage in witty conversation. The physical act, when it finally occurred, was the culmination of an elaborate seduction that might take weeks or even months. This wasn't just about sex. It was about the art of desire itself. The Japanese had elevated foreplay to a spiritual practice. They understood that anticipation could be more intoxicating than fulfillment, that the journey could be more meaningful than the destination. The samurai had their own particular customs around sexuality that might surprise you. While they were expected to marry for political and economic reasons, they were also expected to cultivate relationships with other men. This wasn't considered unusual or shameful. In fact, the bond between an older samurai and a younger apprentice was considered one of the purest forms of love. These relationships, called shudo or nanshoku, were governed by their own elaborate codes of conduct. The older partner was expected to be a mentor, teacher, and protector. The younger partner offered loyalty, obedience, and physical affection. These weren't casual encounters, but deep emotional bonds that could last a lifetime. The samurai understood that love came in many forms. They didn't see heterosexual and homosexual desire as mutually exclusive categories. A warrior might have a wife, several concubines, and a beloved male companion, and society would consider this perfectly normal. The heart, they believed, was large enough to contain multitudes. Even the way they approached the physical act of love was different from what we might expect. Japanese culture had developed a sophisticated understanding of anatomy and pleasure that was far ahead of its time. They had detailed knowledge of erogenous zones, breathing techniques, and positions that could maximize pleasure for both partners. The famous pillow books, or makura no soshi, weren't just crude pornography. They were instruction manuals that combined explicit illustrations with poetry, philosophy, and practical advice. These books were found in the private collections of nobles and merchants alike. Sexuality was something to be studied, refined, and perfected like any other art form. Women in particular were encouraged to understand their own bodies and desires. While they might have limited power in the public sphere, they were expected to be active participants in the bedroom. The ideal woman wasn't passive and submissive during intimate moments. She was knowledgeable, responsive, and capable of giving as much pleasure as she received. The Japanese had also developed an intricate language around sexuality that was both explicit and poetic. They had dozens of terms for different types of desire, different approaches to lovemaking, different emotional states associated with physical pleasure. They understood that sexuality wasn't just about the mechanics of reproduction, but about connection, transcendence, and the exploration of human consciousness. Religious traditions played a fascinating role in shaping these attitudes. Buddhism taught that all desires, including sexual ones, were part of the human condition to be understood rather than suppressed. Shinto, the indigenous religion of Japan, celebrated fertility and the life force that flowed through all things. Physical pleasure wasn't seen as sinful, but as a way of connecting with the divine energy that animated the universe. The seasonal festivals often had explicitly sexual elements. During certain celebrations, normal social restrictions were lifted, and people were encouraged to express their desires freely. These weren't orgies in the Roman sense, but communal celebrations of life force and fertility. Young people would meet potential partners, married couples would renew their passion, and the entire community would acknowledge the power of sexual energy. Even the architecture of Japanese homes was designed with intimacy in mind. The sliding paper screens could create instant privacy or openness depending on the mood. The soft lighting from paper lanterns created an atmosphere of mystery and sensuality. The practice of sleeping on futons that could be easily moved and arranged meant that any room could become a place for intimate encounters. The tea ceremony itself, while not explicitly sexual, was charged with erotic undertones. The careful attention to every movement, the focus on sensation and awareness, the intimate setting where host and guest shared a ritualized experience, all of this created a heightened state of consciousness that could easily spill over into physical desire. Bathing customs also reflected this integration of sensuality into daily life. The elaborate bathing rituals weren't just about cleanliness, but about the pleasure of warm water on skin, the luxury of taking time to care for one's body, the potential for shared intimacy in bathhouses where social barriers were lowered along with clothing. The clothing itself was designed to be both concealing and revealing. The multiple layers of a kimono created endless opportunities for gradual revelation. The way fabric moved against skin, the glimpse of an ankle, or the nape of a neck could be more arousing than complete nudity. The Japanese understood that the imagination was often more powerful than explicit display. Food and sexuality were also intimately connected. Certain delicacies were considered aphrodisiacs. The presentation of food was as important as its taste, with elaborate arrangements that pleased the eye as much as the palate. Sharing a meal could be a form of foreplay, with partners feeding each other choice morsels, the act of eating becoming sensual and intimate. The merchant class, as they gained wealth and influence, began to patronize the pleasure quarters in increasing numbers. They brought their own energy to these spaces, sometimes more direct and less refined than the elaborate courtship rituals of the nobility, but no less passionate. The pleasure quarters adapted, offering experiences for every taste and budget. Young apprentice geishas, called maiko, would spend years learning not just dance and music, but the subtle arts of conversation and flirtation. They studied how to read a client's mood, how to create atmosphere through gesture and glance, how to make every interaction feel special and unique. These weren't skills that could be learned overnight. They required years of dedicated practice. The relationship between sexuality and power was complex and fascinating. While women in the pleasure quarters might seem powerless from a modern perspective, many of them wielded considerable influence. They could make or break political careers through their pillow talk. They could influence business deals through their connections. They could elevate or destroy reputations through their favor or disfavor. Disfavor. The most powerful courtesans understood that their true currency wasn't just their beauty, but their ability to read desire, like ancient calligraphy. They could sense what a man needed before he knew it himself. Sometimes it was gentle submission, sometimes fierce dominance, sometimes the illusion of innocence, sometimes the promise of corruption. These women were psychological artists painting with human longing. In the private chambers above the tea houses, behind screens decorated with scenes of lovers in eternal embrace, the real education began. The courtesans knew that pleasure wasn't just about physical technique, though they had mastered that as well. They understood that the mind was the most powerful erogenous zone, that fantasy could be more intoxicating than reality, that the right whispered word at the perfect moment could drive a man to madness. They would begin with conversation, their voices like silk sliding across skin. They spoke of poetry and philosophy, while their fingers traced patterns on their client's arm. They discussed the cherry blossoms while slowly loosening their obi, the wide silk belt that held their kimono closed. Every gesture was deliberate, every pause calculated to build tension until the air itself seemed to vibrate with anticipation. The removal of clothing became a ceremony unto itself. Layer after layer of silk would fall away, each one revealing new expanses of skin that had been hidden from sunlight and touch. The courtesans knew exactly how to move so that fabric would catch the lamplight, how to position themselves so that shadows would accentuate the curves of breast and hip, how to make even the simple act of breathing seem like an invitation. But the true masters of this art understood that the body was just the beginning. They would map their lovers' responses like explorers, charting new territory. They knew where to press, where to tease, where to withhold, and where to give freely. They understood that pleasure was a conversation between bodies, a language spoken in sighs and gasps, and the urgent press of flesh against flesh. The samurai, despite their reputation for emotional control, often found themselves completely undone in these intimate moments. Men who could face death without flinching would tremble at a courtesan's touch. Warriors who commanded hundreds of soldiers would beg for the favor of a woman who knew exactly how to make them forget their own strength. These encounters weren't hurried affairs. Time moved differently in the pleasure quarters, as if the outside world had ceased to exist. A single evening might unfold like a carefully choreographed dance, with periods of intense passion alternating with quiet intimacy, conversation flowing into caresses, laughter melting into moans of pleasure. The courtesans had learned techniques that had been passed down through generations, refined and perfected, like the forging of a katana. They knew pressure points that could send waves of sensation through their partner's body. They understood the rhythm of breathing, how to synchronize their movements with their lover's heartbeat, how to build sensation slowly until release became inevitable and overwhelming. The physical positions themselves were considered art forms. The Japanese had cataloged dozens of different ways bodies could join, each with its own name, its own particular pleasures, its own emotional resonance. Some positions were gentle and contemplative, perfect for lovers who wanted to gaze into each other's eyes while they moved together. Others were wild and primal, designed for those moments when civilization fell away and only animal hunger remained. The concept of foreplay as we understand it barely existed because everything was foreplay. The entire evening, from the first shared cup of sake to the final exhausted collapse into sleep, was part of the sexual experience. The anticipation was as important as the climax, the afterglow as meaningful as the peak of passion. Sound played a crucial role in these intimate theaters. The courtesans were trained to use their voices as instruments of pleasure. They knew when to whisper and when to cry out, when silence would be most effective, and when passionate vocalizations would drive their partner to new heights of arousal. The sounds of lovemaking weren't considered shameful but beautiful, a natural symphony that celebrated the joining of two souls. The wealthy merchants and nobles would sometimes spend entire fortunes on a single night with a famous courtesan. But they weren't just paying for her body. They were purchasing an experience that would linger in their memories like the taste of perfect wine. These women could make a man feel like the only person who had ever mattered, like his desires were unique and precious and worthy of the most elaborate attention. The younger samurai, though still learning the ways of both war and love, would often form intense attachments to particular courtesans. These relationships could last for years, with the warrior returning again and again to the same woman, building layers of intimacy and understanding that went far beyond simple physical attraction. The courtesan would become confidant, teacher, and lover all in one. In the most exclusive establishments, clients would reserve entire sections for weeks at a time. They would bring their favorite foods, their own musicians, their personal servants. The courtesan would essentially become their temporary wife, sharing meals, conversation, and bed with complete devotion during their stay. When the time came to leave, the parting would often be genuinely heartbreaking for both parties. The seasonal nature of these relationships added another layer of poignancy. Like the cherry blossoms that bloomed brilliantly and then fell, these intimate connections were understood to be temporary and therefore precious. The knowledge that pleasure was fleeting made each moment more intense, each touch more significant. The most skilled courtesans could adapt their entire personality to match their client's deepest fantasies. With one man, she might be the innocent maiden, wide-eyed and eager to learn. With another, she became the experienced woman of the world, sophisticated and slightly dangerous. With a third, she might be the nurturing mother figure, offering comfort and unconditional acceptance. This wasn't deception, but a form of emotional artistry that required tremendous intelligence and empathy. The physical spaces themselves were designed to heighten every sensation. Incense would fill the air with exotic scents that seemed to awaken dormant desires. The lighting was always soft and flattering, creating an atmosphere where inhibitions could dissolve naturally. The bedding was the finest silk, cool against fevered skin, smooth enough to allow bodies to glide together without friction. Music would often accompany these intimate encounters, not the jarring sounds that might distract, but subtle melodies that seemed to match the rhythm of heartbeats and breathing. Sometimes the courtesan herself would sing, her voice rising and falling with the movements of her body, creating a multi-sensory experience that overwhelmed the client's defenses. The attention to detail was extraordinary. The courtesan would remember exactly how her client liked to be touched, what words aroused him most, what fantasies he harbored in the secret corners of his mind. She would greet him on return visits as if he had never been away, picking up conversations and caresses exactly where they had left off months before. The emotional intensity of these encounters often surprised both participants. Men would arrive expecting simple, physical release and find themselves pouring out their deepest fears and desires. The courtesans, despite their professional training, would sometimes find themselves genuinely moved by their client's vulnerability and passion. The morning after was considered almost as important as the night itself. The courtesan would prepare tea with her own hands, serve breakfast in elegant dishes, help her client dress with the same care she had used to undress him hours before. The transition back to the outside world was handled with delicate attention, ensuring that the magic of the night wouldn't be shattered by harsh reality. These women understood that they were selling more than pleasure. They were offering transformation, the chance for their clients to become the men they dreamed of being in their most secret moments. In the arms of a skilled courtesan, a timid merchant could feel like a conquering hero. A war-weary samurai could rediscover tenderness. A lonely noble could experience the illusion of being truly loved. The seasonal festivals brought their own particular pleasures to the districts. During the cherry blossom season, courtesans would arrange elaborate picnics under the flowering trees, combining the beauty of nature with the promise of human intimacy. The contrast between public celebration and private passion created a tension that made every touch more electric. Summer brought the ghost story season, when courtesans would terrify and then comfort their clients with tales of supernatural seduction. The fear would heighten arousal, making the subsequent lovemaking feel like a triumph over death itself. These women understood that all strong emotions could be channeled into sexual energy. With the right touch, autumn was the season of melancholy and reflection, when the courtesans would offer comfort for life's inevitable sorrows. Their embraces became refuges from the approaching winter, their bodies warm havens against the cold reality of mortality. The knowledge that beauty was fleeting made every moment more precious. Winter brought its own intimacies, the need for shared warmth, creating opportunities for prolonged physical contact. Under heavy quilts in heated rooms, bodies would press together not just from desire, but from the basic human need for comfort against the harsh season. The courtesans had developed an understanding of the human body that bordered on the mystical. They knew that desire didn't begin between the legs, but in the mind, in the spaces between heartbeats, in the silence that stretched taut as a bowstring before the first touch. Their fingers could read a man's skin like scripture, finding the hidden verses written in nerve endings and pulse points that spoke of hunger, older than civilization itself. In the dim glow of paper lanterns, these women became alchemists of pleasure, transforming simple flesh into instruments of transcendence. They understood that the most powerful aphrodisiac wasn't any exotic powder or potion, but the feeling of being completely seen, completely desired, completely consumed by another's attention. A skilled courtesan could make a man feel as though he were the only person who had ever existed, as though the universe had conspired to bring them to this moment of perfect union. The removal of a single hairpin became an event that could take an entire hour. The courtesan would let her elaborate coiffure fall in stages, each loosened strand a small revelation, each cascade of dark silk across pale shoulders, a promise of greater intimacies to come. Her client would watch, mesmerized, as order gave way to wildness, as the carefully constructed public persona dissolved to reveal the primal woman beneath. The art of the bath had been elevated to ritual in these establishments. Courtesans would prepare the water themselves, adding oils and flower petals until the wooden tubs became pools of liquid silk. They would test the temperature with their own skin first, ensuring that every sensation would be perfect for their lover. The act of washing another person's body became an exploration of geography, both familiar and mysterious. Steam would rise around their intertwined figures as they moved through the warm water like dancers in a liquid embrace. Soap became unnecessary when fingertips could trace every curve and valley with such exquisite attention. The courtesan would memorize the landscape of her client's body with her palms, learning which touches made him gasp, which caresses made him tremble, which gentle pressures could transform breathing into prayer. The transition from bath to bed was orchestrated like a symphony, each movement flowing seamlessly into the next. Wet skin would be dried with silk cloths, each pat and stroke extending the intimate contact. The courtesan would take her time, ensuring that no drop of moisture remained, while simultaneously discovering new ways to make her touch linger just long enough to drive her partner to distraction. On the sleeping mats, surrounded by screens painted with scenes of eternal spring, the real artistry began. These women had studied the ancient texts that mapped pleasure like astronomers charting constellations. They knew the 36 positions described in the pillow books, but more importantly, They understood that each body was unique, requiring its own particular combination of pressure and rhythm, gentleness and intensity. The courtesan would begin with barely perceptible touches, fingertips trailing across skin like whispered secrets. She would map the territory of her lover's desire with scientific precision, noting which areas made his breathing quicken, where the blood ran closest to the surface, how his body responded to the faintest suggestion of what was to come. This wasn't mere technique, but a form of worship, an acknowledgement of the sacred nature of physical pleasure. She would use her hair as an instrument, letting the long strands drag across his chest and stomach, creating sensations that were almost too subtle to register consciously, but powerful enough to awaken every nerve ending. The contrast between the silk of her hair and the warmth of her breath would create a symphony of sensation that built slowly toward crescendo. The courtesan's lips became brushes painting invisible masterpieces across the canvas of her lover's flesh. She would trace patterns only she could see, following lines of energy that connected heart to groin, throat to fingertips. Her kisses would fall like cherry blossoms, soft and ephemeral, each one a small gift that accumulated into overwhelming abundance. When she finally allowed their bodies to join, it was with the reverence of a priestess conducting sacred ceremony. The initial contact would be so gentle it might have been imagination, a ghost of touch that promised everything while delivering just enough to leave her partner aching for more. She understood that the most exquisite pleasure came not from immediate satisfaction but from the gradual building of tension until release became inevitable as sunrise. The rhythm she established would be ancient as ocean waves, steady and hypnotic, drawing them both into a trance state, where individual identity dissolved into something larger and more primal. She would vary the pace like a master musician, building to crescendos, and then pulling back, creating a tension that made every resumed touch feel like the first caress of a new lover. Her body became an instrument finely tuned to her partner's responses. She could feel his heartbeat through his skin, could sense the exact moment when his control began to slip, could time her own movements to match the rising tide of his arousal. The coordination was so perfect it seemed choreographed by the gods themselves, two bodies moving as one in the eternal dance of creation. The sounds that filled the chamber were a language older than words. Sighs and gasps and whispered endearments created a vocabulary of desire that needed no translation. The courtesan would encourage her lover to voice his pleasure, understanding that the sound of his own passion would amplify the physical sensations racing through his body. She would position mirrors strategically around the sleeping area, not from vanity, but to multiply the visual feast. Her client could see their joined bodies from different angles, could watch the play of lamplight across sweat-dampened skin, could witness the beautiful contortions of pleasure written across both their faces. The visual element added another dimension to already overwhelming sensory experience. The courtesan had learned to use every part of her body as an instrument of pleasure. Her breasts would brush against his chest with calculated casualness, the contact brief enough to seem accidental, but perfectly timed to send jolts of electricity through his nervous system. Her legs would intertwine with his, creating friction and warmth that spoke of deeper intimacies to come. Her hands were perhaps her most versatile tools, capable of delivering touches that ranged from featherlight to firmly demanding. She could trace the line of his jaw with fingertips that barely made contact, then grip his shoulders with surprising strength when passion demanded it. The contrast kept him constantly off balance, never knowing whether the next touch would soothe or inflame. The most skilled courtesans had mastered the art of internal control, using muscles that most women never knew existed to create sensations that defied description. They could vary pressure and rhythm in ways that seemed impossible, transforming their own bodies into instruments of such exquisite sensitivity that their partners would weep from the intensity of feeling. Time became meaningless in these encounters. Minutes stretched into hours, hours compressed into heartbeats. The outside world ceased to exist beyond the paper screens that enclosed their private universe. There were no obligations, no social expectations, no roles to play except lover and beloved, teacher and student, worshipper and goddess. The courtesan would bring her partner to the edge of release again and again, only to pull back at the last moment, extending the pleasure until it became almost unbearable. This wasn't cruelty, but kindness, an understanding that the moment of climax, however intense, marked the beginning of the end. By postponing resolution, she gifted him with hours of sustained ecstasy that would live in his memory like a perfect dream. When release finally came, it would be with the force of a dam bursting, waves of sensation that seemed to originate in his core and radiate outward until even his fingertips tingled with residual pleasure. The courtesan would continue her ministrations through his climax, prolonging and intensifying the experience until he felt as though he might dissolve entirely into pure sensation. But even then she wouldn't stop. The most accomplished women had learned techniques for maintaining their partner's arousal even after apparent satisfaction, using gentle touches and whispered encouragements to rekindle the fire that had just burned so brightly. A single night might contain multiple peaks, each one higher and more intense than the last. The afterglow was treated with the same reverence as the passion itself. The courtesan would hold her exhausted lover against her breast, stroking his hair and humming soft melodies while his breathing gradually returned to normal. These moments of tender intimacy were often more meaningful than the sexual acrobatics that preceded them, creating bonds that transcended mere physical attraction. She would prepare warm tea with her own hands, the simple domestic act made sensual by her recent nudity and the lingering scent of their lovemaking. They would share the cup, lips touching the same rim, a communion that felt both innocent and deeply erotic. The tea would restore their strength, while the shared silence rebuilt the anticipation for whatever might come next. The merchant classes, as their wealth increased, began demanding experiences that rivaled those traditionally reserved for the nobility. They wanted not just sex, but theater, not just release, but transformation. The pleasure quarters adapted by creating elaborate scenarios that could fulfill the fantasies of men whose daily lives were consumed by ledgers and negotiations. Some clients requested specific costumes and scenarios. The courtesan might appear as a shrine maiden who had abandoned her vows for love, or a warrior princess captured in battle and slowly seduced by her conqueror. These role-playing games allowed both participants to explore aspects of their personalities that had no place in their public lives. The psychological element became as important as the physical. A successful courtesan was part actress, part therapist, part confessor. She would listen to her clients' fears and dreams, offering comfort for disappointments and encouragement for ambitions. In the safety of her embrace, powerful men could admit to vulnerabilities they would never show their families or colleagues. The seasonal celebrations brought special opportunities for elaborate seductions. During the festival of Tanabata, when lovers separated by the Milky Way were said to reunite once a year, courtesans would create romantic scenarios that played on themes of longing and reunion. The astronomical backdrop added cosmic significance to earthly pleasures. The ghost story tradition of summer became a vehicle for exploring the connection between fear and arousal. A courtesan might tell increasingly frightening tales while gradually removing her clothing, using the client's mounting terror to heighten his sensitivity to her touch. The moment when supernatural dread transformed into carnal desire was considered a pinnacle of the seductive arts. The moon-viewing festivals of autumn provided opportunities for outdoor encounters that combined natural beauty with human passion. Courtesans would arrange trysts in hidden gardens where their clients could possess them under the same moon that had witnessed countless generations of lovers. The sense of participating in an eternal ritual added depth to temporary pleasure. Winter brought the most intense intimacies, when the need for warmth created excuses for prolonged physical contact. Under heavy quilts, in rooms heated by charcoal braziers, bodies would press together in configurations dictated by both desire and practicality. The season's harsh beauty outside made the softness within seem even more precious. The courtesan's wardrobe was carefully calculated to enhance her natural assets, while creating opportunities for gradual revelation. Layers of silk undergarments meant that undressing became an extended striptease, each removed layer revealing new expanses of skin, while still maintaining an element of mystery. The weight and texture of the fabrics added their own sensual element to every movement. The obi, the wide silk belt that cinched the waist, was designed to emphasize the female form while creating anticipation for what lay beneath. The elaborate knots required skill to tie and even more skill to untie, ensuring that the unveiling process would be deliberate and ceremonial. The sound of silk sliding against silk became an auditory aphrodisiac. Makeup and perfumes were applied with scientific precision to create maximum impact. The stark white face powder contrasted dramatically with reddened lips and darkened brows, creating an otherworldly beauty that seemed to belong more to fantasy than reality. Subtle fragrances would cling to skin and clothing, ensuring that the memory of the encounter would include olfactory triggers that could instantly transport the client back to moments of passion. The courtesan's training included not just sexual techniques, but a comprehensive education in the arts of seduction. She learned to read micro-expressions that revealed hidden desires, to modulate her voice to create maximum erotic impact, to time her movements for psychological as well as physical effect. Every gesture was calculated to build and maintain arousal while creating the illusion of spontaneous passion. The most expensive establishments offered services that went far beyond simple sexual encounters. Clients could commission elaborate fantasies that might take weeks to orchestrate, involving multiple courtesans, custom costumes, and specially designed sets. These productions blurred the line between reality and theater, creating immersive experiences that challenged the very nature of identity and desire. The psychological after effects of these encounters often lasted far longer than the physical pleasure. Men would return to their ordinary lives carrying memories that glowed like banked coals, ready to flare into flame at the slightest provocation. A glimpse of silk, a particular scent, the sound of a woman's laughter could instantly transport them back to moments of transcendent pleasure. The courtesan understood that her true art lay not just in providing pleasure, but in creating memories so vivid and powerful that they would sustain her clients through months or years of ordinary existence. She was selling not just her body, but her ability to transform mundane reality into something magical and meaningful. The relationship between client and courtesan often evolved into something that transcended simple commerce. regular patrons would develop emotional attachments that bordered on genuine love, returning not just for physical gratification, but for the unique form of intimacy that only these women could provide. They offered something that wives, bound by social convention and family duty, could not: the freedom to explore the darker corners of desire without judgment or consequence. In the private chambers, away from the watchful eyes of society, these relationships blossomed into complex emotional ecosystems. The courtesan might begin to anticipate her favorite client's arrival days in advance, preparing special delicacies he enjoyed, arranging flowers in patterns that held secret meaning between them, selecting undergarments in colors that she knew would drive him to distraction. The preparation itself became a form of foreplay that extended across days or weeks. When he finally arrived, the reunion would be charged with accumulated longing. They would fall into each other's arms with the desperation of lovers separated by war, hands frantically exploring familiar territory, as if confirming that nothing had changed in their absence. The first kiss would be hungry, almost violent in its intensity, tongues dancing a battle for dominance that neither wanted to win. But then would come the slow unwinding, the gradual return to the languid pace that had made their previous encounter so memorable. She would pull away just enough to study his face in the lamplight, noting the new lines that stress had carved around his eyes, the slight graying at his temples that marked the passage of time. Her fingertips would trace these changes like a scholar reading ancient texts, each mark a story she wanted to understand. The conversation would flow as smoothly as sake, moving from the mundane details of daily life to the philosophical questions that kept them both awake at night. She would listen with genuine interest as he described his business troubles, his family obligations, his fears about growing older in a world that seemed to be changing too quickly. In return, she might share her own dreams and disappointments, her hopes for a future that remained perpetually uncertain. These intimate conversations were often more erotic than any physical act. The courtesan would position herself so that her kimono fell open just enough to reveal the curve of her breast, the pale expanse of her throat, the shadowed valley between her thighs. She would lean forward to pour his tea, allowing her hair to brush against his cheek, her scent to envelop him like a silk cocoon. Every gesture was calculated to maintain a constant state of arousal, even during the most innocent exchanges. The physical reunion, when it finally occurred, would be tender rather than urgent. They would undress each other with the reverence of pilgrims unveiling sacred relics, each revealed inch of skin a small miracle to be celebrated. The courtesan would map the changes in her lover's body with her lips and tongue, noting where he had gained weight or lost muscle, where new scars told stories of battles fought in her absence. Her own body would be a familiar landscape that somehow remained mysterious, as if her skin held secrets that could only be revealed through repeated exploration. He would rediscover the sensitive spot behind her ear that made her breath catch, the curve of her hip that fit perfectly in his palm, the way her back arched when he touched her just so. The accumulated knowledge of previous encounters would inform every caress, while leaving room for new discoveries. The courtesan had perfected the art of making each sexual act feel like the first time, while drawing on the deep well of shared history. She would respond to his touch with genuine surprise and delight, as if her body were betraying her with its eagerness. Her gasps and sighs would sound spontaneous, even though she had orchestrated similar responses dozens of times before. The performance was so complete that even she began to believe in its authenticity. The physical positions they explored together became increasingly adventurous as trust and familiarity deepened. What might have been shocking or uncomfortable with a new partner became natural expressions of their shared intimacy. The courtesan would guide him toward experiences he had only dreamed of, using her expertise to ensure that even the most exotic encounters remained pleasurable rather than painful. She had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when he was ready for more intense stimulation, when his breathing quickened in a particular way that signaled his approaching climax, when his hands gripped her flesh with just enough force to indicate that his control was slipping. This intimate knowledge allowed her to orchestrate their encounters like a master conductor leading a symphony, building to crescendos and pulling back to create a rhythm that could sustain pleasure for hours. The courtesan's own pleasure, initially perhaps feigned for professional reasons, often became genuinely aroused by the intensity of her partner's response. The sight of a powerful man reduced to trembling need by her touch was its own aphrodisiac, and she would find herself responding with authentic passion to scenarios that had begun as calculated performance. The line between professional service and personal desire blurred until even she couldn't distinguish between what was real and what was artfully constructed. Their sexual encounters became increasingly synchronized over time, like dancers who had rehearsed the same routine until it became second nature. They would move together without conscious thought, bodies anticipating and responding to subtle shifts in pressure and rhythm. The courtesan would know exactly when to increase her pace, when to slow down, when to change positions to create new angles of penetration that would drive her partner toward ecstasy. The sounds they made together created their own private language, a vocabulary of pleasure that existed nowhere else. Her particular way of crying out when he entered her, his specific groan when she tightened around him, the whispered endearments that might have sounded ridiculous in daylight, but felt like poetry in the dim glow of paper lanterns. These auditory memories would echo in their minds during the long periods of separation. The courtesan understood that variety was essential to maintaining interest over extended relationships. She would introduce new elements gradually, testing his responses to different stimulation techniques, different positions, different scenarios. One night she might be the submissive maiden, yielding completely to his desires. The next, she might take control, riding him with an authority that left no doubt about who was directing their pleasure. She had access to an extensive collection of intimate accessories that could enhance their sexual experiences. Silk scarves that could bind wrists without causing pain, oils that warmed when rubbed into skin, instruments designed to provide stimulation that human anatomy alone couldn't achieve. These toys were introduced carefully, always with his consent, always with attention to his comfort and pleasure, rather than mere novelty. The psychological games they played became as important as the physical acts. The courtesan might pretend to be reluctant, allowing him to seduce her all over again, creating the illusion that their encounter was spontaneous rather than purchased. Or she might take on the role of the experienced woman initiating an innocent young man, reversing their actual power dynamic for the sake of fantasy. These role reversals allowed both participants to explore aspects of their sexuality that had no place in their public personas. A merchant who spent his days deferring to social superiors could experience the intoxication of complete dominance over a beautiful woman. A samurai accustomed to constant responsibility could surrender control and allow himself to be pampered and pleasured without having to make any decisions. The courtesan's ability to adapt her responses to match whatever fantasy her client needed was perhaps her greatest skill. She could shift from aggressive to passive, from innocent to experienced, from tender to demanding, all within the space of a single encounter. Her flexibility allowed her partners to explore the full range of their desires without fear of judgment or rejection. The physical space they shared became charged with erotic energy over time. Every corner of the room held memories of passionate encounters. Every piece of furniture had supported their writhing bodies at some point. The sleeping mats retained the impression of their joined forms. The silk screens had absorbed the sounds of their lovemaking. The very air seemed saturated with the lingering essence of their pleasure. The courtesan would arrange the room differently for each visit, creating new environments that would stimulate different aspects of their relationship. Sometimes the space would be austere and temple-like, encouraging reverent spiritual lovemaking. Other times, it would be lush and decadent, filled with flowers and rich fabrics that invited abandonment to sensual pleasure. The setting became part of the seduction, priming both participants for the type of encounter that would unfold. Seasonal decorations added another layer of meaning to their meetings. Cherry blossoms in spring reminded them of the fleeting nature of beauty and pleasure, making each moment more precious. Summer brought cooling influences, ice and fans and minimal clothing that emphasized the heat building between their bodies. Autumn's melancholy beauty created a bittersweet atmosphere that intensified both desire and the poignancy of temporary connection. Winter's harsh beauty outside made the warmth they generated together feel like a miraculous refuge from a cold world. The courtesan had learned to extend the sexual experience far beyond the moment of climax. She would continue touching and caressing her partner long after his immediate needs had been satisfied, keeping his skin sensitive and his mind focused on sensual pleasure. These post-climactic interludes often led to renewed arousal and additional rounds of lovemaking that stretched a single encounter across an entire night. Her understanding of male anatomy allowed her to stimulate him in ways that prolonged his capacity for pleasure. She knew how to apply pressure at precise points that would delay ejaculation, how to vary her movements to maintain his arousal without triggering release until she was ready. This control allowed her to orchestrate encounters that lasted for hours, building and rebuilding tension until the final climax became almost unbearably intense. The emotional intimacy they shared often surprised both participants. What began as a commercial transaction would evolve into something resembling genuine affection, even love. The courtesan would find herself looking forward to his visits, not just for the income they provided, but for the pleasure of his company. He would discover that her conversation and companionship had become as important to him as the sexual satisfaction she provided. These deep emotional connections created their own complications. Jealousy would sometimes flare when the courtesan entertained other clients, even though both parties understood the professional nature of their relationship. The client might find himself wanting to rescue her from her circumstances, to set her up in a private residence where she would belong exclusively to him. Such arrangements occasionally occurred, though they often ended badly for both parties. The courtesan walked a delicate line between emotional availability and professional distance. She needed to make each client feel special and desired, while protecting her own heart from becoming too deeply involved. The most successful women learned to channel genuine affection into their performances, while maintaining enough emotional detachment to function effectively in their demanding profession. The intensity of these relationships often made ordinary domestic life seem pale by comparison. Men would return to their wives and families carrying memories of passion that made their conventional relationships feel constraining and inadequate. The courtesan's complete focus on his pleasure, her willingness to explore any fantasy, her skill at making him feel like the center of the universe, created expectations that no respectable wife could hope to meet. This disparity between the pleasure districts and domestic life was understood and accepted by society. Men were expected to find sexual satisfaction outside marriage, just as they might pursue other entertainments like gambling or drinking. The courtesan provided services that complemented rather than competed with the wife's role as mother and household manager. Each woman served a different function in the complex ecosystem of male desire and social obligation. The most expensive courtesans commanded fees that exceeded the annual income of most working people, but their clients considered these payments worthwhile investments in their own happiness and well-being. The stress relief provided by a night of skilled attention could improve a man's performance in business and family life for weeks afterward. The boost to his confidence and sense of masculine power had effects that rippled through every aspect of his existence. The courtesan understood that she was selling more than physical pleasure. She was providing a complete experience that addressed her client's emotional, psychological, and spiritual needs, as well as his sexual desires. Her ability to create a temporary world where he could be the man he dreamed of being was worth almost any price to those who could afford it. The competition between courtesans for the most desirable clients was fierce, but subtle. Rather than engaging in open warfare, they would attempt to outdo each other in terms of skill, beauty, and the uniqueness of the experiences they could provide. Innovation became essential for survival, in a market where clients had numerous options and increasingly sophisticated tastes. The most successful courtesans developed signature techniques that became their calling cards. One might be known for her ability to bring a man to climax using only her mouth, another for her skill at internal massage that could provide pleasure without visible stimulation. These specialties created reputations that drew clients from across the country. Men who would travel for days just to experience a particular woman's unique talents. The training of new courtesans was a complex process that combined practical instruction with psychological conditioning. Young women needed to learn not just the mechanical aspects of sexual pleasure, but how to read men's deeper needs and respond appropriately. They studied the art of conversation, the principles of aesthetic arrangement, the subtle psychology of desire and satisfaction. The apprenticeship system ensured that skills and knowledge were passed down through generations of practitioners. Experienced courtesans would take promising young women under their protection, teaching them the countless small details that separated adequate service from transcendent experience. This mentorship created lineages of expertise that maintained the high standards expected in the most exclusive establishments. The seasonal rhythms of the pleasure districts created their own patterns of anticipation and release. Certain times of year brought floods of clients celebrating festivals or marking important transitions. Other periods were quieter, allowing for more intimate encounters and deeper relationships. The courtesan learned to adjust her energy and approach to match these natural cycles. The economic realities of the profession meant that even the most successful courtesans had to plan carefully for their futures. Youth and beauty were their primary assets, and both were inevitably temporary. The wisest women saved money and cultivated relationships that could provide security when their earning capacity declined. Some became teachers or managers in the pleasure quarters, while others found wealthy patrons willing to support them in retirement. The stories of famous courtesans became legends that inspired new generations of women entering the profession. Tales of women who had risen from poverty to influence powerful men, who had become wealthy through their skills, who had found true love despite the odds, provided both hope and guidance for those following in their footsteps. The cultural impact of the courtesan tradition extended far beyond the pleasure districts themselves. These women influenced fashion, literature, and social attitudes toward sexuality and femininity. Their independence and economic power challenged conventional ideas about women's roles, creating space for different ways of being female in a highly structured society. The artistic patronage provided by successful courtesans helped support poets, painters, and musicians who might otherwise have struggled to find audiences for their work. The pleasure quarters became centers of cultural innovation, where new forms of expression could be tested and refined before being introduced to mainstream society. The psychological sophistication required for success in this profession attracted women of unusual intelligence and creativity. Many courtesans were accomplished poets, musicians, or artists in their own right. Their salons became meeting places for intellectuals and artists, creating cultural networks that influenced the broader development of Japanese civilization. The legacy of these remarkable women continues to fascinate people across cultures and centuries. Their ability to transform sexuality into high art, to find power and agency within systems designed to constrain them, to create beauty and meaning in circumstances that might have crushed lesser spirits, speaks to something universal about human resilience and creativity. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the last client had departed and the paper lanterns burned low, the courtesan would often sit alone with her thoughts and memories. The silk screens that had witnessed so many passionate encounters now stood silent, the sleeping mats empty of all but shadows. In these moments of solitude, she might reflect on the strange life she had chosen, the pleasures she had given and received, the men whose secrets she carried like treasures in the vault of her heart. The night was ending, but somewhere in the city, a merchant was lying awake, remembering the taste of her lips. A samurai was dreaming of her whispered endearments. A young apprentice was counting coins and planning his first visit to her chamber. The courtesan had touched their lives in ways that would linger long after the physical pleasure had faded, had given them glimpses of transcendence that would illuminate their ordinary days like captured starlight. Tomorrow would bring new clients, new challenges, new opportunities to practice her ancient art. But tonight belonged to memory and anticipation, to the eternal dance between desire and satisfaction that had played out in these rooms for countless generations. The courtesan smiled in the darkness, knowing that she was part of something larger than herself, a tradition that celebrated the most fundamental and mysterious aspects of human nature. The pleasure districts would continue to thrive for centuries more, adapting to changing times while maintaining their essential purpose, to provide refuge from the harsh realities of daily life, to offer experiences that elevated the spirit along with the flesh, to remind people that they were more than just workers and warriors and dutiful family members. They were creatures capable of passion and transcendence, deserving of beauty and pleasure and the tender ministrations of those who understood the sacred nature of human desire. The art of seduction in feudal Japan extended far beyond the famous pleasure quarters into the private chambers of noble houses, where wives and concubines practiced their own sophisticated forms of intimate artistry. These women, bound by different social constraints than the courtesans, developed equally refined techniques for maintaining their husband's interest and securing their own positions within complex household hierarchies. The noble wife understood that her survival depended not just on producing heirs, but on remaining sexually compelling to a man who had access to multiple women. She would spend hours perfecting the subtle arts of domestic seduction, learning to read her husband's moods and desires with the precision of a court astronomer studying celestial movements. Her kimono would be selected not just for its beauty, but for the ease with which it could be removed. The way silk would pool around her feet like spilled moonlight. These aristocratic women had their own collections of intimate knowledge, passed down through generations of mothers and aunts who understood that political power often flowed through the marriage bed. They knew which perfumes would linger on his skin long after he left her chambers, which undergarments would catch the light in ways that made him forget his other obligations, which positions would leave him breathless and desperate for her touch. The seasonal celebrations provided opportunities for elaborate seductions that played out over weeks or months. A clever wife might begin her campaign during the cherry blossom festivals, dropping hints about private celebrations she had planned, letting silk scarves trail from her sleeves like promises of what awaited him in darkness. She would time her monthly cycles to coincide with important festivals, ensuring that her body would be most receptive when the sake flowed freely and inhibitions dissolved like morning mist. The bathhouse became her private theater, where she could display her body to maximum advantage while maintaining the pretense of innocent domesticity. She would time her bathing to coincide with his return from court or business, allowing him to discover her, apparently by accident as she emerged from steaming water, like a goddess rising from a sacred pool. The sight of water droplets clinging to her skin, her hair unbound and streaming down her back, would stop him in his tracks with the force of physical impact. Her sleeping chamber was arranged with the same attention to detail that courtesans brought to their professional spaces. Incense would burn at precisely calculated intervals to maintain an atmosphere of sensual languor without becoming overwhelming. The bedding would be selected for its texture against bare skin, silk sheets that would caress their joined bodies as they moved together in the ancient rhythms of desire. The aristocratic wife had learned to make even the most mundane domestic activities charged with erotic potential. The way she served tea could become a subtle striptease, her movements deliberately calculated to draw attention to the curve of her wrist, the graceful arch of her neck, the way her kimono fell open just enough to reveal the pale valley between her breasts. She would position herself so that lamplight would outline her silhouette through the thin fabric, creating shadows that suggested more than they revealed. Her conversation became another instrument of seduction, topics chosen to remind him of their most passionate encounters, without seeming deliberately provocative. She might mention a poem about lovers meeting under the full moon, knowing that he would remember the night she had led him to their private garden and made love to him beneath the flowering cherry trees. These verbal cues would plant seeds of desire that would grow throughout the day until he found himself counting the hours until darkness fell. The wife's understanding of timing was perhaps her greatest asset. She knew exactly when to be available and when to be mysteriously absent, when to yield completely to his desires, and when to maintain just enough distance to keep him hunting. The game was more subtle than anything played in the pleasure quarters, because it had to sustain itself over years or decades, rather than single nights. Her knowledge of her husband's body became encyclopedic over time, every scar and sensitive spot mapped with scientific precision. She would know exactly how to touch him to instantly rekindle his arousal, which whispered words would drive him to distraction. how to move beneath him to create sensations that would make him forget every other woman he had ever known. This intimate expertise became her insurance policy against younger, more beautiful rivals. The aristocratic bedroom contained its own collection of erotic accessories, though these were often disguised as innocent household objects. A jade hair ornament might double as an intimate massage tool. Silk hair ribbons could serve as gentle restraints during passionate encounters, and decorative fans could be used to create cooling breezes across heated skin. The wife learned to improvise with whatever materials were at hand, turning everyday objects into instruments of pleasure. Her wardrobe was carefully curated to provide maximum erotic impact while maintaining appropriate social appearances. Undergarments were selected for their sensual properties rather than practical concerns. Silk so fine it felt like liquid against skin. Colors chosen to complement her natural coloring in lamplight. The removal of each layer would be choreographed to build anticipation. The unveiling of her body a carefully orchestrated performance that never failed to captivate her audience of one. The seasonal festivals provided opportunities for role-playing games that allowed both husband and wife to explore fantasies that had no place in their daily lives. During the autumn moon viewing celebrations, she might appear as a celestial maiden who had descended from heaven to grant him one night of divine pleasure. The spring cherry blossom festivals gave her permission to embody the spirit of fertility and renewal, her body becoming a garden where he could plant seeds of passion. Her mastery of internal muscle control rivaled that of the most accomplished courtesans. Techniques learned from secret manuals and whispered conversations with other wives who understood the importance of maintaining sexual supremacy within their households. She could create sensations that seemed impossible, varying pressure and rhythm in ways that left him gasping and desperate for more. This physical skill became her signature, something no courtesan could replicate because it was honed specifically to his responses. The psychological aspects of marital seduction were even more complex than those practiced in the pleasure quarters. The wife had to balance multiple roles, shifting seamlessly from mother to seductress, from household manager to passionate lover. She learned to compartmentalize her personality, saving her most alluring aspects for private moments while maintaining the dignified public persona expected of her social position. Her intimate knowledge of his daily stresses and concerns allowed her to provide exactly the type of comfort he needed on any given night. Sometimes he required gentle submission that allowed him to feel powerful and in control. Other times he needed to surrender completely, to be pampered and pleasured without having to make any decisions. The wife's ability to read these subtle cues and respond appropriately was what separated a successful marriage from a merely functional one. The competition with concubines and courtesans was constant and unspoken, but no less intense for its subtlety. The wife had certain advantages, familiarity, and emotional intimacy, chief among them, but she also faced the challenge of maintaining novelty within the constraints of a permanent relationship. She had to continuously reinvent herself, finding new ways to surprise and delight a man who thought he knew everything about her. Her pregnancy cycles became opportunities for different types of intimacy, exploring forms of pleasure that didn't involve traditional penetration but could be equally satisfying for both partners. She learned techniques that could bring him to climax, using only her mouth and hands. Ways of moving against him that created friction without risking harm to an unborn child. These alternative approaches often became favorite memories that he would request even when pregnancy was not a factor. The bath ritual became an elaborate seduction technique that could last for hours. She would prepare the water herself, testing the temperature against her own skin to ensure perfection. The addition of flower petals and aromatic oils transformed the simple wooden tub into a sensual paradise. She would wash his body with her own hands, memorizing every muscle and curve, using the slippery soap as an excuse for prolonged, intimate contact. The drying process was equally erotic. Silk cloths wielded like artist's brushes to trace every contour of his body. She would take her time, ensuring that no drop of moisture remained, while simultaneously discovering new ways to make her touch linger and inflame. The transition from bath to bed became a seamless continuation of foreplay, wet skin sliding against silk until the boundaries between pleasure and necessity dissolved completely. Her own bathing became a performance art designed to drive him to distraction. She would time her ablutions to coincide with his presence, allowing him to watch as she lowered herself into steaming water, arching her back in ways that emphasized the curves of breast and hip. The sight of her hair floating around her shoulders like dark silk, her skin flushed from heat and growing arousal, would reduce him to a state of barely controlled hunger. The sleeping arrangements were adjusted to maximize intimate contact throughout the night. Rather than maintaining separate sleeping areas, as was common among the nobility, she would insist on sharing the same futon, their bodies pressed together in configurations that ensured continuous skin contact. The warmth they generated together became addictive, making any separation feel cold and incomplete. Her knowledge of aphrodisiac foods and preparations rivaled that of professional courtesans, menus carefully planned to enhance desire and stamina. Certain seafood dishes were known to increase circulation. Specific herbs could heighten sensitivity, and the timing of meals could be calculated to ensure peak energy during intimate encounters. The act of feeding each other choice morsels became foreplay, fingers lingering at lips, tongues darting out to catch stray drops of sauce. The aristocratic wife had access to imported luxuries that could enhance their sexual experiences in ways unavailable to most couples. Silk scarves from distant lands provided sensations unavailable from domestic textiles. Exotic oils created warming sensations when rubbed into skin, and rare incense could induce states of relaxation that made even familiar touches feel like new discoveries. These foreign elements added mystery and novelty to their encounters. Her mastery of the shamisen and other musical instruments allowed her to create soundscapes that enhanced their lovemaking. She would play softly while he undressed, the music matching the rhythm of his movements, building tempo as passion increased. Sometimes she would continue playing even during their intimate moments, the vibrations of the strings adding another layer of sensation to their physical connection. The seasonal decorations in their private chambers were chosen specifically for their erotic associations. Spring brought flowers known for their aphrodisiac properties. Summer offered cooling elements that made heated skin even more sensitive to touch. Autumn's melancholy beauty created bitter-sweet moods that intensified every caress, and winter's stark simplicity focused all attention on the warmth they created together. Her collection of intimate garments was extensive and carefully maintained, each piece designed for specific types of encounters. Silk so fine it was nearly transparent for nights when she wanted to drive him mad with glimpses of what lay beneath. Garments that opened in strategic places for encounters that required partial clothing. Colors chosen to complement candlelight and create maximum visual impact against pale skin. The wife's understanding of male psychology allowed her to create scenarios that fulfilled fantasies her husband might never have articulated. She could sense when he needed to feel powerful and dominant, arranging encounters where she played the role of innocent maiden being gently corrupted. Other times, she recognized his need to surrender control, taking charge of their lovemaking with an authority that left him breathless and grateful. Her knowledge of pressure points and erogenous zones was encyclopedic, accumulated through years of careful observation and experimentation. She knew exactly where to touch to make his breathing quicken, which caresses would make him tremble with anticipation, how to bring him to the very edge of climax before pulling back to extend their pleasure. This intimate mapping of his responses became her greatest weapon against potential rivals. The psychological games they played grew more sophisticated over time, elaborate fantasies that might unfold over several encounters. She might begin by playing the role of a reluctant captive who slowly succumbed to her captor's seductions, her resistance gradually weakening until she became the aggressor pursuing her former master. These extended scenarios created anticipation that built across days or weeks. Her ability to vary her personality and approach kept their relationship from falling into predictable patterns. One night, she might be the submissive wife grateful for his attention. The next, she could transform into a demanding goddess who expected worship and complete devotion. This psychological flexibility prevented the boredom that destroyed so many long-term relationships. The seasonal festivals provided opportunities for elaborate costume play that allowed both partners to explore different aspects of their sexuality. During Ghost Story season, she might appear as a supernatural seductress who had come to claim his soul through pleasure. The cherry blossom celebrations gave her permission to embody the spirit of spring fertility, her body becoming a garden where he could lose himself in sensual abundance. Her mastery of scent and fragrance created an invisible web of seduction that surrounded him throughout the day. Specific perfumes would linger on his clothing after their encounters, subtle reminders of pleasure that would trigger memories and desires at unexpected moments. She learned to layer different fragrances to create complex bouquets that would unfold over hours, revealing new notes as his body heat activated different elements. The wife's collection of erotic literature provided inspiration for new techniques and scenarios. These texts, often disguised as poetry or philosophical treatises, contained detailed instructions for advanced lovemaking that went far beyond basic physical mechanics. She studied these manuals like a scholar preparing for examinations, determined to master every technique that might give her an advantage over her competition. Her understanding of timing extended beyond simple scheduling to encompass the psychological rhythms of desire and satisfaction. She knew when to be immediately available and when to create artificial scarcity that made her attention more valuable. The balance between accessibility and mystery was delicate, requiring constant adjustment based on his changing moods and circumstances. The physical exercises she practiced in private were designed to maintain and enhance her sexual capabilities. Specific breathing techniques could increase her stamina and sensitivity. Muscle conditioning allowed her to maintain positions that maximized pleasure for both partners. Flexibility training ensured that age would not limit their ability to explore new configurations and possibilities. Her knowledge of herbal remedies included treatments that could address various aspects of sexual health and performance. Certain teas could increase sensitivity and desire. Specific oils could enhance stamina and endurance. And particular foods could be combined to create natural aphrodisiac effects that made their encounters more intense and satisfying. The wife's ability to create atmosphere through environmental manipulation was perhaps her most underestimated skill. She understood how lighting could transform familiar spaces into exotic landscapes, how temperature could be adjusted to heighten sensitivity, how sounds and scents could be layered to create immersive experiences that transported them both to realms of pure sensation. Her mastery of the tea ceremony became another form of erotic performance, every movement choreographed to draw attention to her grace and sensuality. The ritual preparation and serving of tea could become an extended striptease, with clothing gradually loosened and removed as the ceremony progressed. The shared consumption of the tea itself became a form of intimate communion that prepared both participants for deeper physical connection. The seasonal moon viewing traditions provided opportunities for outdoor encounters that combined natural beauty with human passion. She would arrange private celebrations in hidden corners of their gardens, places where they could make love under the same moon that had witnessed countless generations of lovers. The connection to cosmic rhythms added spiritual significance to their physical union. Her collection of silk scarves and ribbons served multiple purposes in their intimate encounters. These could be used for gentle bondage that enhanced sensation without causing discomfort, as blindfolds that heightened other senses, or simply as additional textures to be dragged across sensitive skin. The versatility of these simple accessories meant that familiar encounters could be transformed with minimal preparation. The wife's understanding of male fantasy extended to elaborate role-playing scenarios that allowed her husband to explore aspects of his sexuality that had no place in his public life. She might appear as a traveling courtesan who had sought shelter for the night, a captured enemy princess who slowly succumbed to his charms, or a goddess who had descended from heaven to grant him divine pleasure. These fantasies required considerable acting skill and psychological insight. Her knowledge of seasonal rhythms and their effects on male physiology allowed her to time their most important encounters for maximum impact. Spring brought renewed energy and vitality that could be channeled into passionate reunions after winter's enforced separation. Summer's heat created opportunities for cooling touches that felt like salvation. Autumn's melancholy intensified emotional connections that made physical pleasure more meaningful. Winter's harsh beauty outside made the warmth they generated together feel miraculous. The aristocratic wife's position in society gave her access to information and resources that courtesans could never obtain. She knew her husband's business concerns, family obligations, and political pressures in ways that allowed her to provide exactly the type of comfort and distraction he needed. This intimate knowledge of his complete life situation made her irreplaceable in ways that went far beyond sexual satisfaction. Her ability to seamlessly blend domestic duties with erotic performance meant that even the most mundane activities could become charged with sexual tension. The way she served his meals could become a subtle form of seduction, every movement calculated to remind him of their most intimate moments together. The preparation of his clothing could involve touches that lingered just long enough to kindle desire for the evening ahead. The wife's understanding of her own body and its responses allowed her to orchestrate encounters that provided maximum satisfaction for both partners. She knew exactly how to position herself to enhance penetration, which movements would create the most friction, how to control her internal muscles to provide sensations that seemed impossible. This physical mastery became her signature, something that distinguished her from all other women in his life. Her psychological sophistication allowed her to maintain multiple relationships within the complex ecosystem of noble household dynamics. She had to navigate rivalries with concubines while maintaining appropriate relationships with servants and family members. The social skills required for this balancing act were considerable. requiring constant attention to subtle cues and shifting alliances. The seasonal festivals provided opportunities for gift-giving that could enhance their intimate relationship while maintaining appropriate social appearances. A silk hair ornament that served dual purposes, decorative oils that could be used for massage, or rare incense that created atmospheric effects during their private encounters. These gifts demonstrated thoughtfulness while serving practical purposes in their ongoing seduction campaign. Her mastery of traditional arts like calligraphy and flower arrangement became additional tools for expressing desire and maintaining his interest. Love poems written in her own hand could be left in places where he would discover them throughout the day, building anticipation for their evening reunion. Flower arrangements could incorporate blooms with specific erotic associations, creating visual reminders of their shared passion. The wife's ability to adapt to changing circumstances was perhaps her most valuable asset. As her husband aged and his needs evolved, she adjusted her approach accordingly. What worked to seduce a young warrior might be completely inappropriate for a mature statesman. The successful wife learned to read these changes and modify her techniques to remain relevant and desirable throughout their relationship. The transformation of the aristocratic wife from maiden to mistress was a journey that unfolded over years of careful study and practiced seduction. What began as dutiful submission evolved into something far more intoxicating, a deep understanding of how desire could be cultivated, nurtured, and wielded like the finest blade. She learned that true power in the bedchamber came not from beauty alone, but from an almost supernatural ability to anticipate and fulfill needs that her husband didn't even know he possessed. Her fingers became instruments of exquisite torture, capable of drawing pleasure from the most unexpected places. She would trace patterns across his skin that seemed random, but were actually carefully calculated to awaken nerve endings in precise sequences. A touch behind the ear that made his breath catch, followed by the lightest pressure at the base of his throat that sent electricity racing down his spine. She mapped these responses like a cartographer, charting unknown territories, each discovery adding to her arsenal of intimate knowledge. The art of undressing became a performance that could last the entire evening. She would remove each garment with deliberate slowness, pausing between layers to gauge his reaction, to watch hunger build in his eyes until he trembled with the effort of restraining himself. The silk would whisper against her skin as it fell, creating sounds that became as arousing as any visual stimulation. She understood that anticipation was often more powerful than fulfillment, that the promise of pleasure could drive a man to madness more effectively than any physical act. Her mastery of internal control reached levels that seemed almost mystical. She could grip him with muscles that contracted in waves, creating sensations that defied description. These techniques, passed down through generations of wives who understood that sexual satisfaction was their greatest insurance policy, allowed her to provide experiences that no courtesan could replicate. The intimacy of marriage gave her advantages that commercial encounters could never match. The nocturnal hours became her domain, when social conventions fell away and primal instincts took control. She would wake in the depths of night to find him stirring beside her, his body responding to dreams of passion. Without a word, her hands would begin their exploration, coaxing him from sleep into arousal so gradually that the transition felt like floating between consciousness and ecstasy. These midnight encounters, unplanned and urgent, often proved more memorable than their most elaborate seductions. Her collection of intimate oils and unguents grew to rival that of any pleasure house in the capital. Each preparation served a specific purpose, some designed to increase sensitivity until the lightest touch became almost unbearable, others formulated to provide warmth that spread through the body like liquid fire. She would apply these substances with the precision of a master painter, knowing exactly where each type would have maximum effect. The psychological aspects of her seduction techniques became increasingly sophisticated as she learned to read the subtle signs of his deepest fantasies, a certain way his breathing changed when she assumed particular positions, the involuntary sounds he made when she touched him in specific ways, the words that slipped from his lips during moments of abandon. She collected these clues like precious gems, using them to construct scenarios that felt spontaneous while being meticulously planned. Her voice became another instrument of pleasure, modulated to create maximum erotic impact. She learned which whispered endearments would make him lose control, which sighs and gasps would drive him to desperation, how to time her responses to amplify his own arousal. The sounds of their lovemaking became a private language that existed nowhere else, a vocabulary of desire that only they could understand. The seasonal rhythms of their relationship created cycles of separation and reunion that she orchestrated with careful precision. During his absences on business or court duties, she would send letters that were masterpieces of subtle seduction, describing her dreams and desires in language that was technically appropriate, but unmistakably erotic. By the time he returned, his imagination would be so inflamed that their reunion became explosive. Her understanding of male psychology allowed her to create scenarios that addressed his deepest insecurities and fantasies simultaneously. If he felt threatened by younger rivals, she would demonstrate her preference for mature experience over youthful enthusiasm. If he worried about his performance, she would orchestrate encounters that showcased his abilities while concealing any limitations. This emotional intelligence made her irreplaceable in ways that transcended physical beauty. The wife's knowledge of aphrodisiac cuisine became legendary within the household. She would personally oversee the preparation of meals designed to enhance desire and stamina, incorporating ingredients that had been used for centuries to inflame passion. The presentation of these dishes became part of the seduction, her fingers lingering as she fed him choice morsels, her tongue darting out to catch stray drops of sauce in ways that made innocent dining feel like foreplay. Her sleeping chamber was transformed into a temple of sensuality, where every element was carefully chosen for its erotic potential. The lighting could be adjusted to create different moods, from the harsh brilliance that revealed every detail of their bodies to the soft glow that turned their coupling into shadow play against the walls. The temperature was controlled to ensure that their skin remained sensitive to touch, cool enough to make warmth precious, but warm enough to allow for extended exposure. The wife's collection of silk restraints and accessories grew to include items that could transform familiar encounters into entirely new experiences. Scarves that could bind wrists with enough pressure to create excitement without causing pain. Blindfolds that heightened other senses until every touch became electric. Feathers that could trace patterns across sensitized skin until the lightest contact felt like fire. These tools were introduced gradually, testing his responses and preferences. Her mastery of timing extended beyond the obvious rhythms of arousal to encompass the psychological cycles that govern desire. She learned when to be immediately available and when to create artificial scarcity that made her attention more valuable. the balance between accessibility and mystery required constant adjustment, reading his moods, and adjusting her availability accordingly. Sometimes the most powerful seduction was the one that was postponed until anticipation reached unbearable levels. The seasonal festivals provided opportunities for elaborate fantasies that could unfold over multiple encounters. She might begin a cherry blossom season scenario weeks before the actual celebration, dropping hints about special preparations, allowing glimpses of costumes and props that suggested elaborate pleasures to come. By the time the festival arrived, his anticipation would be so intense that reality could hardly match his fevered imagination. Her knowledge of erogenous zones extended far beyond the obvious areas to include points that most people never realized could be sources of pleasure. The inside of the wrist where pulse points created sensitivity, the hollow at the base of the throat where breath could be felt as well as heard, the curve where neck met shoulder that seemed designed for gentle biting. She mapped these discoveries like a scholar documenting new species, each finding adding to her repertoire of techniques. The wife's ability to vary her approach based on seasonal and emotional cycles kept their relationship from falling into predictable patterns. Spring brought renewed energy that called for vigorous encounters that celebrated fertility and new life. Summer's heat demanded slower, more languid couplings that emphasized endurance over intensity. Autumn's melancholy created opportunities for bittersweet tenderness that made every touch precious. Winter's harsh beauty outside made the heat they generated together feel like a miracle of creation. Her understanding of her own body's responses allowed her to orchestrate encounters that provided maximum satisfaction for both partners. She knew exactly how to position herself to create the most intense sensations, which movements would bring her closest to climax, how to time her responses to coincide with his peak arousal. This self-knowledge transformed her from a passive recipient of pleasure into an active participant whose enthusiasm amplified every aspect of their physical connection. And so we reach the end of our journey through the silken shadows of feudal Japan, where desire was elevated to an art form, and pleasure became a pathway to transcendence. We've explored chambers where bodies moved like poetry in motion, where every touch was deliberate, and every sigh held meaning deeper than words could ever express. These weren't just stories of physical gratification, but glimpses into souls that understood something profound about human nature. In a world where honor and passion danced together beneath cherry blossoms and paper lanterns, the people of medieval Japan created a legacy that still whispers to us across the centuries, reminding us that desire, when treated as sacred, becomes something far more powerful than mere flesh meeting flesh. Sweet dreams, and may your own nights be filled with the kind of transcendent pleasure that those ancient lovers knew so well.